So it's been a while since I made a video. Had some stuff that just kind of got in the way and kind of kept me from making any videos for a while, and then just some other stuff that got in the way even more. And so I was kind of planning on getting back to making videos in about a month because next month I'm going to be traveling. And so I was like, well, when I get back, I'm gonna kind of sit down and get back into making videos. But there's something that I wanted to talk about uh, now, while it's still kind of worth talking about it. Not that it wouldn't be worth talking about later, but just that doesn't don't want to lose all of the weight of the moment. And it involves the Odyssey. And not just that, I don't want to necessarily like talk specifically about the film or anything, though I am going to get into those things because I haven't seen Nolan's Odyssey. I don't plan to see it. Maybe when it comes out on streaming, I might watch it. But just what I know about it, and it's not like just rumors of, oh, it's woke or all these things. Not that, just the things I know that specifically that they have changed make me not want to see it, regardless of their reason for the changes. Um, but that's kind of what I want to talk about, is myths in general. And so the Odyssey is obviously a jumping off point for that. But I want to talk about some other myths as well, and not just ancient ones. I want to touch on the Odyssey and the Iliad and that whole kind of Trojan War uh, mythos that exists, but also going into coming forward with it, because there's a trend that I noticed uh, relatively recently as I was looking. I reread the Odyssey and the Iliad um, because I wanted to refresh myself, because I was hearing different people talk about the stories and the things that they liked or didn't like about what they were hearing about the movie, let alone once it came out. And so I sat down and I reread them, but not just those. I read the works around them, because if you don't know, the Iliad and the Odyssey don't have everything within them. There's a gap between the two books that actually encompasses the final end of the war. The Iliad itself starts after the war's already been going on for 9 years. It's the 10th year of the war of the Greeks against the Trojans. The Odyssey picks up another 10 years after that, because Odysseus is lost at sea for 10 years. And so there's essentially like a 10-year gap between the two, that you don't even see the fall of Troy until you get to Odysseus's journey home, when he actually gets home finally. And so I read some of the things around it, like the Little Iliad. There's two different Siege of Troy, Siege of Ilium. Um, they call it the abduction of Helen, which does not use the word abduction. It uses a word that if you say on YouTube, you can get you can get flagged for, of Helen. And so some of those things, as well as some of the other pre-Iliad stuff that encompasses the earlier years, the first of those 9 years of the war leading up, like the gathering of the Greek forces and various other things. So I was refreshing myself on all of that. And then I started looking at, some things that came after that, looking at the dates of various things and thinking about where some of the sources for all of those things came from. But it's just very, so that's all very interesting. If you haven't read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the works around them, I recommend it. I recommend you read the originals, as well as the versions that came afterwards and all of those things. And what I was noticing is that the further you got away from Homer's work, the more the variations kind of took a certain bent. And this is going to lead into what I want to talk about today, which is myths and the way that they get changed over time, and how the time that we live in now is doing the exact same thing to the exact same types of stories for the exact same reasons. It's just accelerated. So there's nothing new, right? That's a common phrase, a common concept that gets talked about, but it's true. There is nothing new that's done. Like the Nolan changing the Odyssey to fit in kind of his modern ideals about things, and tying it into like immigration things and all of this, and the importance of hospitality and Zeus's law and all this. First off, that is a key feature of the actual work, but the way he's implementing it and using it is very different than the way that the original works use those concepts, because the violation of Zeus's law and hospitality is what led to the war. It's not what Odysseus did at the end that ruined everything and that he's traumatized about. It's actually what started the war in the first place. If you don't know, Paris, the Trojan prince, he kidnaps Helen. They weren't just like star-crossed lovers that ran away together. In the earliest versions of the story, he kidnaps her because Aphrodite, the goddess, promises her to him, but she's already married. And so he actually goes on his own to Sparta to kidnap her. And he lies to Menelaus to get into his court. Then he kidnaps Helen and robs them. And then he goes back to Troy. So in the earliest versions, the Trojans are not the good guys and the Greeks the bad guys, though that is what it ends up becoming over time. But neither are all of the Trojans bad. It's Paris is the bad guy. Like his brother Hector is still a great hero. Helen, even in the story, says that of all the Trojans, he was the only one who was kind to her, because the other Trojans treated her like garbage because they blamed her for the war. Because if she hadn't been so beautiful, Paris would have never kidnapped her, basically, as if it was her fault. But so that's kind of the backdrop of it. But as you get further away from it, you start to see this bent of altering things. And that gets into, for example, it's not just Christopher Nolan's version that paints the various Greek heroes as these negative figures. I know that in Nolan's version, for example, Agamemnon is painted as a bad man. Menelaus as well. It's implied that he scars Helen's face, that he and her are at odds and definitely don't have a happy marriage. Whereas in the actual story, they do, because they rescued her. She wanted to go home. Her first line in the Iliad is about how she misses Menelaus. She wants to go home to her family. That includes her daughter that she has that is still in Sparta, that she was kidnapped away from. And so she wants to go home. So it's interesting too, because Nolan wanted to kind of portray Odysseus as this PTSD ridden kind of person that war kind of broke and blames himself for these things, when that's actually Helen. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just a beautiful woman who got kidnapped by this guy. And yet she struggles with blaming herself, even into the Odyssey, when Telemachus goes to Menelaus to see if he knows anything about what happened to his father. Helen is still kind of blaming herself for everything that happened, even though it wasn't her fault. And so you actually kind of had a female in the story that you could have portrayed struggling with that because one of the things that they did in the marketing was they pushed like, oh, it's so much more pro women than the original. But when you look at it scene for scene, they not only entirely removed female characters, they cut them down. They have less screen time. They have less agency with the way that they're portrayed and the things that they do. They have actually reduced women in their role and their capacity and the way that they were presented by Homer, because Homer presented the women as just as complicated, just as heroic, just as flawed as the men. Agamemnon's wife she betrays him, she has a lover, and then her lover kills Agamemnon. In Nolan's version, I believe he has her kill him, which was a later addition to undermine Agamemnon. Because the later editions got further and further away from the Greek tradition, and eventually the Romans started writing their own versions. And the Romans traced their lineage back to the Trojan hero Aeneas. And Aeneas was the son of Aphrodite, and he survives the sack of Troy, goes to Italy, and essentially establishes the forefather. He's like the progenitor of what eventually led to Rome. So when you get to the Roman versions of the story, you start to see the Trojans being more romanticized, more heroic, and the Greeks start getting portrayed in a more negative light. They get portrayed more barbaric, all of these types of things. And it's because of the propaganda of it. It's because there was this story, this myth that was about heroism. That one of the key points of the Odyssey is showing that men will go through hell to get back to a good woman. So women be good women and men be heroic men who are willing to go through that. And it's meant to show that the men and women in the way that we should relate to each other, but also shows the flaws that people have and how some people fall short and all of these other things, and how it's meant to be a human story about humanity. And that's what the original myths were all about. It was about the glory of war with the tragedy of war. It was about the roles of men and women, good and bad. But people want to twist it, and you start seeing this very early on, because within a couple hundred years, You start to see versions of the story where, for example, Achilles, his ghost shows up and demands a human sacrifice. When, if you read the Iliad, Achilles is not a person who would have demanded a human sacrifice in the way that he does in that later edition. You see versions of the story of characters that show up where Diomedes is one of the Greek heroes, and he's one of the Greek heroes that gets home almost with zero problem because he's beloved by Aphrodite. She empowers him. He wounds a pair of gods. The removal of the gods is a huge thing because that necessitated cutting like four of the most important characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey, who are all women. Athena is a, yeah, I think I said Aphrodite a second ago. I meant Athena. Diomedes is beloved by Athena, and she empowers him. And he actually goes and he wounds Aphrodite and Ares twice. He injures the god Ares. One time, while Athena is literally driving his chariot, he wounds Ares. And so because of that, he gets home with almost zero problem. But a couple centuries later, they alter the ending. The different authors, they decided that, well, that's boring. We're going to have his wife cheat on him the same way that Agamemnon's did, even though in the Iliad, his wife is listed as one of the faithful women who do not betray their husbands while they're at war, while some other women do. Similarly with Odysseus. So the Odyssey ends with Odysseus getting home, killing the suitors, killing the traitorous handmaidens and other servants, and then standing against the families of those people when they come to try to enact their revenge. And then Athena comes down. Another, if you want to see a powerful woman, Athena has to be a part of the story. She is a key figure. In a lot of ways, the Iliad and the Odyssey, she is actually the main character, which is one of the reasons it's so crazy that you remove the gods, but then you want to talk about being a pro-woman story when you remove this central female figure who is probably the most important character in the entire story. A lot of the male characters could be interchanged, you could cut them out, you could combine them and all these things, and the core facet of that aspect is the same, but when you remove Athena as a core figure, you undercut almost the entire story. But so she forces them to kind of come to peace, and the implication is that the rest of the prophecy of Odysseus getting home, which is that he would go to an inland place where the people had never seen the sea, and he would tell them about Poseidon, and then he would come home and he would die basically an old man surrounded by his family at peace. That's kind of how it ends, the implication that Odysseus is going to live a happy life. He lives happily ever after with his wife and his son. Well, later authors, a couple hundred years later again, they changed it. They found that boring. And so they have Circe, who was Odysseus's lover for a year while he was blown off course and trying to get home. She and her son basically show up, and her son kills Odysseus. Now, whether her son is Odysseus's that she got pregnant with while they were together or not, it doesn't really. There's ambiguity there. But so he kills Odysseus. Then Circe's son marries Penelope, a woman who stayed faithful for 20 years, using her cunning. And this is another thing. Penelope used her cunning to help her maintain her faithfulness. Uh, because she was Odysseus's wife. She was his equal, and he's known for his cunning, and she's a very cunning person as well. They were a strong pairing who complemented each other and strengthened each other. And that's one of the implications in the story is that when you find that person that complements you well, you are better for it. So that's part of it too that Nolan just glosses over and kind of throws away in his desire to make her a powerful, boss bitch or whatever he decided to do with her based on the clips and everything I've seen. Um, but so Circe's son kills Odysseus, and then her son marries Penelope, and then Telemachus, Odysseus' son, marries Circe. So they added this double cucking of Odysseus essentially at the end when they decided that the way it ended was boring. So how are we going to add drama? We're going to have him get murdered by someone who's potentially his son, who then marries his wife, while his other son marries his former lover, which it's very interesting how often cuckoldry becomes the way that people tend to undermine older heroes. That leads me to the second point. So all of that goes into the Odyssey, that they've completely undercut the story, they've completely changed everything about it, and they've done it for a reason that is entirely unnecessary because the original actually contains everything they claim they want it to contain. It contains women being heroic and women being flawed. It also has men being heroic and men being flawed. But because in our modern setting, they say they want to give women agency and have powerful women. And the way they do that, though, is by utterly undercutting them. They portray women who cannot be flawed and can only be heroic. And they also do this by portraying men who are only flawed and are not heroic, which in the case of the Odyssey is difficult to do. My understanding is that he still gets home and kills the suitors, which is probably one of the best parts that they keep, luckily. So, which is one of the reasons that I might want to watch it when it comes out on streaming, because it is difficult to entirely remove the core foundational principles of the story if you're going to show any parts of it at all. And so that's kind of the Odyssey, and the way that they've undercut it and they've changed it, and they've entirely missed the point. Because like I said, Nolan in his own interviews and things has said that one of the key things he wanted to get across was the importance of hospitality and this is Zeus's law, and treating the visitor and the stranger well, and those types of things. But he wants to do it in a way that, like, is essentially, he's using it as an analog for like immigration. This is why it was important for them to cast people of different ethnicities. The people from Ithaca are, there's black and white and Asian, and, all of these things. And another interesting thing in the actual mythology, around the time you have Ethiopians mentioned. There's even an Ethiopian hero who shows up that fights against the Greeks on behalf of the Trojans. And so you actually have in the story people of other ethnicities. Menelaus goes to Egypt. So, and in Egypt, there were people from the further south, the lands of Ethiopia in there that you could have shown. So just telling the story as it was, they actually could have incorporated all of this. And so that's why that that's not really what they were looking to do. Something I've said before to people that I've talked to, I haven't said it in a video, but is that it seems to me like what Christopher Nolan actually wanted to do was make a sequel to Troy, the Brad Pitt Orlando Bloom movie, as opposed to actually making an Odyssey movie. Because he removes the deities and all those things like that version did. He kind of builds off that version's more pro-Trojan. The Greeks are bad guys. They violate Zeus's law, even though it was Paris violating Zeus's law in the first place that led to the war itself. And they didn't actually violate Zeus's law, because in the story, one of the sons of Priam comes to the Greeks and he actually tells them how to sack the city for complicated reasons. But so he actually he actually gives them a workaround for Zeus's law, because he is the one who kind of invites them in to sack the city. He helps them do it. And they only end up losing the favor of the gods at the end, because Ajax the Lesser violates Athena's temple in a very brutal way. And then she withdraws her favor, and she's probably the main character of the entire Trojan War. And so to cut out the gods is to cut out the character that is probably the most important. But that's kind of all the Odyssey. And again, if their goal was actually to show strong women being strong, and to show, flawed but noble men, and those types of things, and their goal was to just tell the story, it actually has everything. And to show the importance of Zeus's law, it actually has all of that built into it. Removing the Cyclops' ability to talk, and him and Odysseus having a back and forth, and Odysseus outsmarting him. They basically just make the Cyclops a brute, and they make Odysseus look stupid. It turns it into an idiot plot. Similar thing on the island of Circe and Calypso's island. The way that they've changed it to try to say men bad, women always good, it completely undercuts everything that they've done, that the actual book does better. They should have just done it the way it was, because it was better at even getting across the messages they claim to care about. But that leads me to, I kind of laid out the case there a little bit of showing how over time things change, and it's nothing new. So Nolan's done it now, but previous people did it before. The movie Troy with Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom did it. They changed things. They made the Trojans more heroic, the Greeks more flawed even than they were. They're not perfect heroes. Diomedes is probably the closest to a perfect hero. Him and Hector are and they're on the different sides too. So you have the Greek kind of Diomedes as one of the perfect heroes, and then Hector, the Trojan, is the other like most perfect hero. But they're not perfect, but they are the closest to it. Um, and so Homer was very fair in his representation of the Greeks and the Trojans. But later on, the Romans, especially, because again, they trace themselves back to the Greek hero Aeneas, who is, like Hector, is one of the more kind of perfect examples of a hero. They promoted kind of a pro-Trojan thing. This is where we get Helen of Troy. You probably have heard Helen of Troy as the way that's how you've heard it. You've heard that her and Paris fell in love and they ran off together, and Menelaus was this kind of wicked, lecherous old man who just wanted a pretty young bride and all those other things. And so Menelaus basically forced her to marry him anyway, and Paris rescues her kind of from him and takes her to Troy. And then the vile Greeks show up to re-kidnap her from her true love, Paris. And it's like, that is not the story. That is not the way it's portrayed in Homer or any of the contemporary works. And that only shows up later. Especially when you get to the Roman era, where they started not twisting in like, not even necessarily in a negative way, because I think that changing myths is okay as long as you don't lose the core point of it. And so even in some of those traditions where the Trojans kind of become more heroic and the Greeks less heroic, as opposed to them both being heroic, but filled with some men who are flawed in both sides, and Paris just being a garbage coward person anyway, that you can change some things. You can add things, you can remove things. That's part of the myth building in the first place. That's part of when you look at fairy tales, right? Like, how many dwarves are in the story of Snow White? Well, which story of Snow White are you talking about? There's multiple versions of the story that you know of her with the dwarves, but there's also a story of her with that specifically one dwarf and her sister Rose Red. A lot of people don't even know Rose Red exists, that Snow White has a sister in the fairy tales, because you don't know the fairy tales. But that is another thing that kind of gets changed. I'm going to get into that this isn't just about undermining like masculinity or those types of things. And you'll hear that a lot on the internet, that they're undercutting Odysseus or they're changing the story to undercut masculinity. And I think that's part of it, but it's not limited to that when these things happen. These things also happen with female-centric stories, and sometimes it's small things like, it doesn't really matter whether you have Snow White's story has Rose Red in it or not. It's about Snow White, so she doesn't necessarily have to have a sister, and it depends on which version you're telling, and all of those types of things. And so the little nuances can easily be changed. Like Hansel and Gretel, did they leave breadcrumbs, or did they leave something else behind them? There's different versions. Ultimately, the point of the story is, be careful going out into the woods alone, especially if you're a little kid. Like, you might get kidnapped or worse, right? But moving forward, so that's kind of my outline for the Odyssey, right? But when you move forward, you see the same thing happen with the King Arthur myth. So around the 5th century AD, the myth of King Arthur starts to grow, starts to kind of appear in legendary form. This figure of King Arthur as this great British king who of the British people of the Angles, the English people, this English figure shows up. And that myth persists and grows for about 700 years or so. And in the 1200s, England's at war with France. And a French poet invents the character, not whole cloth. He's mentioned in one or two stories prior to that, but always as just a minor figure. But basically, this French author just invents this character, the fully realized character of Lancelot. So we're talking over 700-ish years later. The figure of King Arthur and his wife Guinevere, this figure of Lancelot is created by a French author who, what does he do? He seduces Guinevere and cucks King Arthur. And that becomes the kind of more prominent version of the story that you have likely heard more often. The idea of Lancelot not being part of the King Arthur mythos is more foreign to most people than the idea that he is a key central figure to the whole story, part of even what ends up leading to the fall of Camelot and the death of Arthur. But it was created by a Frenchman specifically to undermine the English king at a time when France and England were at war over who would rule essentially France and England. And so you have this heroic king, Arthur, his faithful, loyal, graceful, all of the things that you would want in a queen, Guinevere. And then this figure, Lancelot, a French knight, comes into the English court seduces the English queen and undermines the English king, and basically leads to the destruction of his realm. But that's the version that you likely know. You likely don't even, again, you likely can't even fathom a version of King Arthur's story that does not include Lancelot. And Lancelot was not even, again, like I said, he's not even mentioned prior to that, except in one or two things where he's just another knight of the Round Table. And there's other knights like Sir Gawain, and others that are much more prominent. They have entire stories dedicated to them and all of those things. And yet he's now become one of the most famous when he didn't even exist prior to the French building him up and transporting his version of the version of the story that includes him, throughout continental Europe so that it became the more well-known one. And again, this was 700-ish years later. With Homer's epics, it took around almost 1,000-ish years to really get rid of the kind of pro-Greek side of things. Really pro-Trojan side of things started taking more form. You had the heroes either being twisted or changed, or doing things that are out of character for the way that they appear in Homer's work. And then 700 years later for King Arthur, you have King Arthur, and then 700 years later, boom, a change. And then we're going to move forward again. So again, this is a pattern that I noticed, that these myths being twisted and changed to push agendas, and or because that's just a boring version of the story. And when you move forward, you see that this gets faster and faster over time. And so I'm going to move forward a bit now to Wicked. So The Wizard of Oz came out over 100 years ago, and Wicked came out in the 90s, I believe. And it billed itself as the true story of the Wicked Witch of the West, the untold history, the prequel to The Wizard of Oz. And there are people who think that it legitimately is the prequel to The Wizard of Oz. They don't know that it's basically fan fiction. That's all it is. It's fan fiction that got popular. And it tells this version of the story that completely undermines the original. So when The Wizard of Oz was originally written, it was a children's book, and so it has very clear good and evil. Wicked witch, good witch, right? Wizard of Oz, even in the original story, the wizard ends up being more complicated than he really is, right? He's not this great and terrible, he is a great and terrible wizard, but then you find out, oh, he's just a man, right? But Wicked undercuts and undermines the entire premise of it. So one of the things that the author of The Wizard of Oz wanted to do was he wanted to write it's a series of books that you would read with your child as they got older. So the first one is very simple. Dorothy in the story is only like 12 to 14, maybe 15 at the oldest. She's a young girl, and she gets taken into Oz, and she sees these fantastical things, and she encounters these good and noble characters and this wicked vile witch and these other things, and she meets these heroic characters that kind of travel with her and look after her and help her get to Oz, and then she has to go confront the witch, and she ends up defeating the witch. And even in the story, the way she does it, so the first witch, the first evil witch, the Wicked Witch of the East, dies because her house lands on her. So Dorothy basically kills that witch through no fault of her own. And then when you get to the end, when she kills the Wicked Witch, it's the same kind of thing. It's accidental. She throws the bucket of water to save the Scarecrow, killing the Wicked Witch of the West. So Dorothy, young girl, is able to defeat the Wicked Witch while maintaining her innocence. So she defeats evil while maintaining her innocence because of her innate goodness of wanting to save her friend. And that is how the story is supposed to end. The Wicked Witch is vile and evil, but Dorothy is an innocent young girl. So how do you have her defeat this evil witch? Because she does it while she's trying to save her friend. And so it's this great moment of like, you can do good, and you can even defeat evil just by doing good. You don't have to even do evil or even come close to evil to defeat evil. Sometimes you can just defeat evil by being good enough. And that is a very childish and simplistic message because it was for children. And then as the books go on, and you were supposed to read them with your children as they grew up, and your children eventually reading them on their own, the story gets more complicated. More and more characters are added in, some who are more nuanced, who start evil but then become heroic, and that start as antagonists, I should say, not necessarily start evil. Some that are only antagonists because of their circumstance. And you start to see the depth kind of come. And so, but people talk about Wicked like, oh, it adds this depth to the story. And it's, again, another situation where the depth is already there. You just have to tell the actual story as it is. But the author wanted to attached themselves to something that already existed, and they wanted to change it and twist it, because, like Tolkien says, evil cannot create, it can only twist, and I'm paraphrasing Tolkien, but it can only kind of twist what's already there. It can only destroy or twist what's already there. It cannot create anything new. And so, and I'm not trying to say that Wicked is like evil necessarily. I think it's just was a lazy fan fiction creator who just wanted to call up, because fan fiction can be good in the sense of it can be a great writing tool, because the characters in the world are already created, so you can focus on other aspects of the story, and you can become a better storyteller through those means, and then character development and other things are skills that you learn in other ways. But that's not, but people who want to take fan fiction and then turn it and make it into an avenue of wealth or all those other things, that's not what they're doing. They're not doing it as a writing exercise or just because they really like the setting and they want to tell the story a slightly different way or anything. If it's for you and your friends, fan fiction can be awesome. But when you start trying to like make it into its own thing, and even more so when you try to change the original, and that's what Wicked does, is it changes the original, it alters it in a fundamental way, it completely undercuts and undermines the message. And again, this is why it's not just male stories. It's not just about undercutting masculinity, like you see with the Odyssey, or like you see with what some people have done to King Arthur, that you now think of as the true version of King Arthur's story, where he gets cuckolded. Looking at things like Rings of Power and what it did to Lord of the Rings, is doing to Lord of the Rings, or Wheel of Time, and the way that it undercuts male characters to lift up female characters, like that. It's not limited to that, because even in those you see them undercutting female characters, which might touch on those a little bit, like how Rings of Power utterly mutilates Galadriel and turns her completely on her head. Interestingly enough, again, by cuckolding a male hero, by having her love affair with Sauron, despite the fact that her husband Celebrimbor not only is still alive, because he's apparently going to show up in the next season, but in the story he's a heroic. I'm not. I don't want to get too deep into a whole bunch of different ones. Focus on Wicked, right? But so it also undercuts female characters. So it utterly changes Glinda. I said Galadriel. Now that messed up my Glinda, the Good Witch, is undercut through Wicked. Even the Wicked Witch is altered and changed. Like, she's not the same character. She was a character with agency. This idea that women can't be evil is one of the biggest ways of removing female agency that I've ever seen in storytelling. But they act like they're doing it to try to promote women. And it's like, no, women can be bad guys too. Dude. Like, why can't women just be villains? Let them be villains. It's okay. Women can be bad. Men can be bad. Women can be good. Men can be good. Uh, it's crazy that the idea that actually treating men and women equally is somehow undermines women. It's insane to me, because that's what you see, for example, in Nolan's Odyssey. Odysseus kills the suitors, but in Nolan's version, from what I've heard, they don't have him kill the female servants. The 12 female servants who were sleeping with the suitors and helping them. One of the female servants is even the reason that Penelope starts to get forced to potentially even choosing one of them when she doesn't want to. Like, essentially, one of the female servants, almost, if Odysseus hadn't gotten home, would have been the reason that Penelope had been forced into a marriage. But they removed that because women can't have agency. Women can't make bad choices. And if they do make bad choices, they can't suffer the consequences of them. It changes the same thing with Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, by telling the version of the story where she kills him in a bathtub because he sacrificed their daughter, which the way that it happens in the story is that Agamemnon kills a deer that Artemis was like a blessed deer that belonged to Artemis, and then he boasts that he's a better hunter than Artemis, and so she curses them, and she basically says, if you want me to lift my curse, so that you can get to Troy to fight the war to rescue Helen, then you need to sacrifice your daughter. Agamemnon gets his daughter, and she's an adult, not a child, gets his adult daughter and brings her to Artemis, and Artemis replaces her with a deer and then takes her. So he sacrifices her by giving her to Artemis, and she basically becomes like a priestess of Artemis. It's similar to the story in the Bible that people try to twist to say that, like, the Bible has child sacrifice because one of the kings said he was going to give to God whatever came out of his house, and his daughter comes out and then he kills her. And it's like, no, even in the story, it's very clear that he doesn't kill her. He gives her to God. She becomes essentially a nun, like that. She becomes a priestess, servant of the Lord. She doesn't get killed. It's a similar thing with Agamemnon's daughter. So the addition several centuries later of Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon because of that, it makes no sense. She killed him because she had an affair with another man, and they wanted to continue to rule the kingdom when Agamemnon came home. So they ambush him and kill him. Um, but that's the thing. You that's why this matters. That they're undercutting these myths not just from the masculine and male perspective, but even from the actual feminine, women having agency, women being important in the story perspective, because they remove the capacity for these women to be variations of the gradients from heroic to evil, because they can only be up here in the heroic area. So all the women, all the female characters end up being the same. There's no variation in them, and it actually destroys the ability to tell a good story with female characters. And that's why you have all of these female centric movies that flop, because you, at most, you're telling a boring story of a bunch of carbon copy boss bitches, and at worst they just attach what they claim is toxically masculine when men do it, but then they just attach it to women, like they did with Captain Marvel, for example, where she is the most toxically masculine hero that Marvel has ever made. And so they completely undercut and destroy the capacity for female stories. And again, that's why I wanted to kind of talk about Wicked a little bit, because that's what ends up doing it too. Glinda the Good Witch is completely changed. The Wicked Witch of the West is completely changed. It damages the story of Dorothy, and I believe in her version, Dorothy is just aged up anyway. Not in her version, in the Wicked version, Dorothy. Cause I don't know if a man or a woman actually wrote that. I probably should have looked that up. But in that version, in the Wicked version, I believe that Dorothy is aged up in it. She's not like a young teenage girl, maybe not even teenager. She could have been preteen, because it's from like 12 to 14-ish is the age that she's depicted in the story. It doesn't give her exact age, but just based on the circumstances, and the target audience was that age of kid or younger. And then again, the story was meant to grow with the child, and you were meant to see deeper themes as the as different books came out. They added to the lore. And so you move forward again, though. So that was 100 years. So with Homer and his epics, the biggest changes started around 700 years to 1,000 years, kind of in that area was where you started getting really big changes, and like real like undermining of certain characters and themes and those types of things, twisting who was kind of more, which side was the good side, which side was the bad side, all of those things. You move forward 1,000, 2,000 years, you get to King Arthur, and then that's 700 years to Lancelot. And now everyone thinks that Lancelot is a character that's always been there from the beginning, that he and Guinevere were true love, had their affair, and ended up destroying Arthur's kingdom through that, because he wasn't actually a great noble king. He was a jealous cuckold who wanted to keep Guinevere for himself out of his jealousy and all these other things, when she never really loved him and fell in love with Lancelot, and they were star-crossed lovers, and all of that, which similar to what you see in some of the Greek Homer, and again, the way that they change things. Move forward again, you get to Wicked, which is 100 years after the events, after Wizard of Oz is created. You get to Wicked, where they've changed things. Now we're getting to where it's not, that's essentially it's multiple generations. Then it's, again, still multiple generations, but fewer. Then you get to Wicked, where it's like three generations, right? And the story is changed and begins to be altered. And it's not just them. You see this with characters like Superman and Batman and other characters that are from the early 20th century that were created in those times, Solomon Kane, Conan, other characters from around that era, as they're now starting to be changed as well. But because of media, you see a rapid increase in this. Now it's not just stories from back then; it's Star Wars, it's the Marvel movies, right? And not even just Marvel comics, which some of those do go back to can go back to almost 100 years ago now. It's DC, especially, goes back to that far. It's things that are coming out now within less than a decade are being changed. You have things like Star Trek and Stargate, even, that got changed from when Stargate first came out to the latest seasons of Stargate. Not the latest seasons, but the latest series, because they made Stargate and then Stargate Atlantis, and then the other Stargates. You started to see this kind of undermining of the heroism of the characters who came before. So now it's not something that's taken 1,000 years. It's not something that's taking 700 years. It's not even something that's taking 100 years. It's something that's taking 10 years. This undermining and undercutting of heroes, just from Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Iron Man to now, you see an undercut of the heroic character as he existed then. You see the Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man who was flawed but heroic. And as soon as he realized what his company was doing, he changes. He is impacted by I forget the character's name, but when he gets kidnapped and there's the old man in the caves with him who helps him build the first arc reactor to power his first suit, that the change that occurs to him, much like Odysseus in the Odyssey, and this arc of his heroism from beginning to end. And then you come to now, where you have a character like Ironheart, who was invented specifically to undermine Tony Stark. Oh, Tony Stark was an arms dealer, so she can be a thief. And never mind that it's just bad story. That there's just bad storytelling in all of these undercutting things. You see the same thing with Star Trek when you get to things like Starfleet Academy, or the way that Star Trek Discovery, or these things undercut the mythos and undercut the heroes that came before it, and not even, and because they're not even building off of the actual legends and stories, because the distinction between something like Star Trek and something like the Odyssey is literally just the medium in which we tell them. The point of myth has not changed, whether that myth is modern Star Trek or whether that myth is the Odyssey. The point of myth is the same, and it is to tell a story. It is to tell a heroic story. It is to show humanity at its best, but also at its worst, but then striving to be its best. That is the purpose of myth, is to get us to a better place, to get us to a higher ideals, to show us the high ideals, and to show us men and women who live up to them. But that requires meritocracy, that requires justice, that requires the idea that not everything is equal, not everyone can have an equal outcome, that there are some people who are good and some people who are bad, and our society today cannot have that. So it is impossible for us to tell good myths, good stories. And because evil cannot create, and fundamentally this equitability, this equal outcomes, this everyone's the same and we're all just, cookie cutter, every one of us, that is evil, and that is why it must destroy the myths. And because of the way that we have social media and we have the internet and we have these other things, they are able to do it so much more rapidly now that you can see it. You can see the change happening in real time with things that you grew up with being the thing that's undercut. So it's not like you only ever grew up with the version of King Arthur's story that includes Lancelot. You are watching them undermine King Arthur by adding Lancelot in a parallel sense, right? You are watching them undercut Captain America and Thor and Tony Stark's Iron Man as we saw them even just a few decades ago. Those characters were introduced and have now been undercut. And you see this with Star Trek and Star Wars and Wheel of Time and these other stories that you can watch, again, in real time, them undercut. And this is intentional. This is not something that's done on accident. Anytime someone takes an existing story, a myth, and changes it, they're doing it for a reason. They're undercutting it for a reason. Their goal is to tell something, to show something, to get you to believe something. And if they change the thing that they're using for it, they're doing it for a purpose that is opposite of that. So if the point of the Odyssey is to tell us a story of heroism and good men and good women overcoming evil men and evil women, then if they change it, the only reason to change it is because you want to teach a different lesson. So if the lesson is good men and good women beating evil men and evil women, the only other lesson you can teach is evil men and evil women beating good men and good women. And whether you're successful at that or not, or whether that people enjoy that enough to engage with it or not, that's another story. And the Odyssey seems to be doing well financially. It seems to be making a lot of money, but that is not. Hollywood's going to learn all the wrong lessons from that. They're going to say, "Oh, see, woke, go broke isn't true." And it's like you're. This is the exception that proves the rule, because this shows that people will go see things in spite of the wokeness if the other stuff with it is good enough. Like, people trust Christopher Nolan, it's epic, it's this grand scale, it has some practical effects, all these other things. So having all of those things could kind of compensate for that, but that people aren't going to see it because of the weird gender stuff, or because of the weird ethnic stuff, or because of the marketing around making it more pro women, even though it's less pro women, has less women in it that have less screen time. Not for nothing that because they made Helen and Clytemnestra twins played by one woman, they actually also removed the capacity to hire another woman. So they actually they didn't just cut out women. One of the women they kept, they made played by one of the women that was already in it, so cut a woman's job while keeping the woman character. Which, again, it just shows you that this is all bullshit, that that they don't actually believe what they say they believe. They don't actually want to push what they say. They don't actually believe these things that they promote. Because if he actually wanted to tell a pro woman story, again, he would just tell the story as it is, because it is pro woman. It does lift up women. Homer gives ample screen time to female characters, but ultimately it is a story about Odysseus, who is a man. So it does follow him more because it's his story. In the same way that if you were going to tell the story of Snow White, you spend more time with Snow White than you do with the woodsman or even Prince Charming or other central male characters, because the main character has the bulk of the screen time. And if the main character is Odysseus, that means a man should have the bulk of the screen time. Doesn't mean that you're cutting women out. And again, Nolan cut out more women and gave them less time than the actual Homeric version of the Odyssey did. But fundamentally, I'm going to kind of wrap up there that myths matter. Myths matter because they teach us lessons, and they teach us lessons in a way that is meant to be engaging and pull us in and help. And we can empathize with the character without having to go through what the character has, or sympathize, I should say. We can sympathize with the character without having to actually go through the things the character has, and thus we're able to learn from that character. We're able to learn from their flaws, but also from their good qualities. We're able to learn from their victories and their defeats without having to face those defeats ourselves. It's a way that we can learn from others. Even if they're fictional, we can still learn from them. There's the expression that was it Otto von Bismarck, I think, who said that a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. A fool has to learn from their own mistakes. So if you're one of those idiots who says, you have to learn from your own mistakes, you're dumb. Stop doing that. Learn from the mistakes of others. Watch other people and learn from them. If you're a young woman, look at the women who are now old, who are saying feminism failed them. Stop believing feminism. If you're a young man, same thing. Look at older men where they've succeeded and failed and learn from them. Learn from the people around you. You don't have to go through terrible things to learn. You can learn from others. And that's the point of stories. Stories are supposed to teach us. Myths are supposed to teach us the lessons of other people. And if they're based on real people, even more so. When you look at stories about real people who really lived, and because we can't be certain that, like, Achilles was a real person, or he was just invented as a character. We don't know definitively. But for example, someone like Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they were actual people who actually lived, but their story got mythologized into, all the way up to William Shakespeare. And so you have real people who really lived that you can learn from historically, but also in your life. You have your parents, you have other people, and you can learn from them the good and the bad that they did. You just have to have the wisdom to hear their stories, to listen to their stories, and to learn from them. You don't have to make the mistakes yourself. But that's why stories are important. But that's also why people want to undercut them. That's also why people want to take them and change them, because it is the what they want to do is they want to attach themselves to something else. So, for example, in the Star Wars Acolyte, Lena Headey wanted to attach herself to Star Wars because Star Wars was successful, and she wanted to tap into that. You see this all the time, where with like video games and other media, where people, for example, the new Lanterns show that's coming out is also being undermined. The guy who's creating it, I don't know if he's a showrunner, head writer, said that the reason they're calling it Lanterns and not Green Lanterns is because he thinks green is silly. And it's like, that is the entire point of the character. is that he is the Green Lantern because there are other lanterns for other colors because each color represents an emotion and the rings are powered by emotions. So he's a Green Lantern because green is willpower. Green is that overcoming of your fear. That is the point of the color green. That's why he's a Green Lantern. It's like, yeah, it's silly, but that's because it's a comic book. Like the silliness actually makes it more accessible and easier to understand, but he wants it to be gritty and real, and silliness doesn't have a place in it or whatever. And it's like, you are the same person who looked at Odysseus getting a happy ending and said, that's boring. I don't like that Odysseus got a happy ending, so I'm going to write a version of the story where he gets murdered and then double cucked by his son and possible other son who hook up with his lover and his widowed wife. Like, you are a bad person if you do that kind of thing. Like, no, you are a bad person. You aren't just taking a story and attaching yourself to it. You are a person who looks at this epic and says, I can do it better. That version that's been successful and everyone loves it's boring. I can do it better. But I'm going to wrap it up there. I think I already said I was going to wrap it up. Might even have said it twice. So 3 times wrap it up now. 3rd time's the charm. But fundamentally, that's where I want to leave it. That myths are important. People undercut myths, though, and anytime that they do, you have to ask why, and you have to be suspect, and you shouldn't just let them get away with it. You shouldn't just be okay with it, and you shouldn't just say like, well, you can change things. And it's like, well, yeah, you can change some things, but if you're entirely inverting the story, and that's the problem. They aren't just adding things or changing things. Looking at something like the Odyssey or the Iliad, like if you wanted to combine 2 characters or you wanted to add a more detailed version of events or something like that, if you're not undercutting the story like that, that can be fine. There are different versions of some of these events anyway. Like whether Cassandra, who's one of the daughters of Priam, who's the king of Troy, whether she lives or dies. Um, there are versions of the story where she lives and some where she dies, even though in the Odyssey, Agamemnon says he hears her scream while Clytemnestra murders her or kills her. He's also already dead, and he was dying as he heard her scream, and he assumes that she was killed as well. Even with less than a century later, you have a version where Cassandra survives, and she actually goes on in a different stories to be foundation, very important in different aspects. So you can even change things but you shouldn't undermine it. And if you see somebody inverting it or undermining it, you should not support them. You shouldn't go see Wicked because it undermines the original. You shouldn't go see this Odyssey because it undermines the original work that it's trying to adapt. You shouldn't watch the new Star Wars or the new Star Trek because it's literally trying to undermine and destroy what came before. And if what came before was trying to teach us to aspire to something higher and they're trying to undermine it and destroy it, then what are they shooting for? Because if they were shooting for something higher, or if they were first off, if they were better storytellers, they wouldn't need to attach themselves to something else anyway. They would make something new. Anytime that you have to attach yourself to something else, especially to try to undermine it, just shows that you're a bad storyteller. Make your own story and tell your story, your version, your own story that can go anywhere you want. But whenever you try to undermine, so you have to ask yourself why. If the original was trying to tell us to be better versions of ourselves, but they're undercutting that, why are they undercutting it? Because they don't want us to be better versions of ourselves. So stick to the originals, find the originals, read them. Don't support this bullshit that people are making nowadays. Stop doing it, or they're just going to keep making more, and they're just going to keep undercutting our stories and our myths and destroying our culture and our heritage. And I don't just mean white culture and heritage, though that's a part of it too, because they also do this to Black culture and heritage, and African culture and heritage, and Japanese culture and heritage, like they tried to do with the Assassin's Creed game, the most recent one, where they literally added in a Black samurai who cucks Oda Nobunaga, who's again a huge part of the pattern is cucking heroic characters. That's one of the fastest ways they try to undermine people's stories. But so if you like the video, please hit like, subscribe, comment down below. It's probably going to be another month before I make another video because I'm going to Europe for the entire month of August. But when I get back, I want to get back and I want to kind of hit the ground running, so to speak, making videos again, talking about things. I just wanted this one to come out while there was still some talk, while the Odyssey was still relevant enough to be a topic of a video, kind of the foundation of a video, even though I went into a bunch of other stuff. So talk about it in the comments if you want to talk about it. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one. See you later.